We'll be starting in a few minutes. So tonight's talk is by Andrés Gómez Emilsson. He is the Director of Research at the Qualia Research Institute. He has a background in psychology, statistics, graph theory, and is a bit of a maths genius. So I guess take it away, Andrés.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's see. Share my screen. Share screen. Excellent. Share. All right, can people see my screen? Any audio confirmation? Nemo?
It's working, yeah.
Oh, perfect. All right, yeah. So, psychedelic epistemology. So, yes. Essentially, the thing that I'm going to talk about is how, there are key phenomenological observations that I think are quite important for developing a science of exotic states of consciousness. And these observations are, things that, as I'll explain, are not necessarily things you can read about in the scientific literature. And it's not exactly either something that you can find on drug forums, although that gets a little bit closer. But you will be able to find these on a few very interesting books and also in some QRI content. So I'll get started. So as a bit of a background, there is definitely this issue that facts dictate theory just as much as the other way around. So in a way, in principle, like theories are to be kind of developed from kind of like a body of facts. And then we find the best fit for, okay, what is kind of like a way of aggregating all of those facts in a way that you get, really good predictions, you get rid of the noise, you don't overfit, you don't underfit. But it seems to be very much the case that at least insofar as consciousness is concerned, it has been historically the case that essentially theory dictates facts quite a lot, right? So just as an example, like we had, almost an entire century of behaviorism, or at least half a century of behaviorism, like such an extremely outlandish and kind of divorced theory of consciousness, in some sense, kind of a theory of the absence of consciousness, or the not needing consciousness for explaining and understanding organisms, which, clearly is kind of like an extreme case where the theory is dictating the facts rather than the other way around. I would definitely, suggest that, for example, functionalism in philosophy of mind does exactly the same thing, almost to the same extent as behaviorism. Maybe it's not as egregious, but it does get pretty close. So, given this very, very, very strong historical precedent, I think it is very worth asking the question, for example, can DMT experiences really be accounted for by predictive coding, or by the free energy principle, or like functional localization, or like notions of neural causality, like grander causality? So given the absence of alternative paradigms, as it turns out, okay, like if behaviorism is telling you like, yeah, don't worry about experiences, epiphenomenal, just worry about behavior and reinforcement. And then you have like these super exotic experiences, in the absence of a sensible scientific paradigm, a lot of people tend to default to just kind of like go into the paranormal cluster. It's like, okay, science cannot explain what I experience, therefore there must be, something really magical going on. This, sociologically generates a problem where you get either people who become like true believers in science, in the top-down theory of science that is neglecting the facts of consciousness, and then people who are essentially just kind of like winging it and saying like, no, it's just something so radically different, it must be paranormal. And I worry that to some extent this may be going on right now with paradigms like the free energy principle or predictive coding. I mean, talking to researchers and people in university, PhD students, is very common, nowadays. It's like, okay, but can you put that in a free energy framework? Can you put that in a predictive coding framework? But it's like, hey guys, I'm actually showing like really relevant data that maybe has nothing to do with predictive coding. Although, I mean, ultimately everything is connected to some extent. Yes, predictive coding can account for some features of the psychedelic experience, and I'll explain a little bit about that. So just kind of like a note, something that has like really puzzled me is that, okay, like if you do kind of like have such a strange experience, let's say you take LSD and you have like this experience of telepathy with a friend of yours, which is reported. I mean, there's like a lot of Reddit posts about telepathy on LSD. Two people take, I don't know, 200 micrograms, and then they kind of like hang out silently. And after like a couple hours, they realize they have been exchanging a whole conversation without opening their mouth. Now, conveniently, there hasn't, ever been a recording, as far as I know, that showcases this phenomenon, but it appears all over the place. Okay, I'm agnostic. I don't know if it's real or not, but here's like one suggestion if you actually think there is something to this. So according to Dean Radin, I believe it's the Noetic Foundation, people who do believe in the paranormal, they have identified a set of kind of like criteria that increases the probability of psi phenomena. So they describe things such as like psychological closeness, genetic relationships, recent interactions, meditators, shared tasks, or kind of like a shared context, or the use of psychedelics. So to me, a very low-hanging fruit, like a very obvious possibility, would be to apply all of these conditions at once, just to make sure the effect actually happens. So if I were to actually take seriously this cluster, I would say, yeah, let's get identical twins who were brought up together and spend most of their time together, who are hardcore meditators and who just spent the last 3 months on a retreat doing the exact same thing. They love each other and who are currently on 250 micrograms of LSD. And under those conditions, let's get them to do a grass field experiment. I mean, if this increases the effect sizes to such an extent, then in principle we might just need one experiment, and you get something like 99% accuracy, and then we're done. We have shown that psi is a real thing. Okay, well, that's just kind of like a side note. I'm not personally that interested in pursuing the paranormal cluster. Rather, I am interested in not giving up on my facts because my facts are really important and they're not accounted for by the theory. Okay, so what are these facts? Okay, I think this slide is about, basically, people kind of abandon the project of reductive naturalism quite easily as soon as they actually encounter facts that the theory cannot predict. And again, like behaviorism or functionalism, it's kind of like making the mistake that just because the current theory is the most advanced or most popular, most cited, that it is in some sense in any way kind of like a complete theory of consciousness. So as a very important kind of like piece of background, I would say that the aim of QRI in the psychedelic space is actually field building, right? So we're not like only going to kind of like trying to talk about like, okay, is there a predictive coding interpretation of this phenomena or not? Really, we're kind of like suggesting new paradigms for making sense of these experiences, making sense of exotic states of consciousness more generally. And here are like kind of like some suggestions for essentially how to actually go about into developing this new paradigm, which we might describe as kind of a field building. But I'll go into more depth into these. So as one very key kind of like paradigmatic improvement, I would mention, this concept of psychedelic epistemology. So in most kind of like neuroscience research on psychedelics, on exotic states through meditation and so on, nowadays we have kind of like this third-person scientific studies approach, where you kind of like take a large row of people who don't know each other. They all have like some exotic experience. Maybe you do neuroimaging on them, and you give them questionnaires or psychophysics, word analyses, things of the sort. And that's great. I mean, that collects a lot of data, and I think is very helpful. But it's quite limited when it comes to actually getting like high quality phenomenology. Why? Because you're limited to giving them questionnaires that were developed by people who don't necessarily are experts about the phenomenology of psychedelics, right? Like, it is my opinion, very much so, that like if you look at the mystical experience questionnaire, I don't think it was developed by a phenomenologist. I don't think it's somebody who was like, taking hundreds of trips of LSD and like actually really paying attention to the experience and then cataloging it so that we can have kind of this set of like, okay, what actually happened. Like, no, it's kind of like a weird mix of like spirituality concepts, religious concepts, kind of like vague ideas. And yeah, it kind of has like some predictive value, but it seems very far removed from actual phenomenology. And then more so, everybody who has this experience in a way then kind of just goes away, or maybe they have like a repeat follow-up, but that's about it. The information actually gets lost, dissipates. Then you have the second possibility, which is what we're used to with kind of like the more weird aspect of, I guess, people exploring psychedelics, which is individual explorer types, where you have like a psychonaut like John Lilly or Terence McKenna. More recently, Christopher Bach came out as kind of like a hardcore psychonaut worth listening to. And I think like you should definitely read all of this content. But for the most part, you experience a lot of overfeeding because essentially you have like one person who's developing these ideas, these metaphysics, and then it's kind of reinforcing them and exploring them from different angles over and over again without necessarily kind of like questioning or really diving into like the background philosophical assumptions or scientific assumptions that underpin the interpretation framework for the experience. Instead, what we suggest will actually provide the most beneficial breakthroughs in the science of consciousness is going to be a think tank model. So essentially, a critical mass of smart, introspective individuals driven to faithfully characterize the phenomenology and the observed dynamics of exotic states of consciousness. And the reason why this is so important is because, I mean, not only you get like critical feedback and critical thinking, because you can bounce these ideas off with others, but it also there's kind of this property that like after like very exotic experiences, there's kind of like this exponential decay of how much access you have to them. Or I don't know, maybe it's like a hyperbolic scale, but the point is like it decays relatively quickly. Especially, I don't know, something like DMT, like within an hour, you've forgotten like a lot of phenomenal character, unless you happen to be somebody who's really lucky and can actually remember that sort of thing. But in a sense, this is why you need a critical mass, like enough people who are close enough to the phenomenon at hand that collectively they can still reconstruct structural features of those experiences. And I mean, to some extent, I would say, well, yeah, when it comes to meditation and exotic states of consciousness for the last 5-6 years at QRI, not specifically people at QRI, but actually kind of this thing we call Phenomenology Club, inviting, just super smart, driven, introspective individuals to share actually their phenomenology on things such as mania or migraines, or indeed things such as 5-MeO DMT. Okay, so that's an important like paradigmatic change I would definitely suggest. Another important point is that it is very easy to kind of like overlook how constrained an actual full theory of consciousness has to be in order to actually solve the problem of consciousness. So this list comes from David Pearce, and there's kind of like an expanded list. I also recommend looking into the 8 subproblems of consciousness by Michael Johnson in Principia Qualia. But yeah, I mean, in brief, any scientific theory of consciousness must be able to explain why consciousness exists to begin with. That is kind of like a very important criteria. And yeah, I mean, most theories really don't do that. The second one is explain the nature and scope of qualia varieties, qualia values, and their interrelationships. I mean, there's, for example, the logo of QRI maps out the state space of phenomenal color, where, yeah, I mean, basically all phenomenal color is part of the same qualia variety, because there is a path between any particular point in that color space to any other point in that color space through just noticeable differences, kind of like there's a gradient path towards it. And a qualia value is like a specific point in one of those spaces. For example, the qualia variety of color is different than the qualia variety of sound, because there's actually no way of bridging between them without like changing something fundamentally qualitative in the middle. Third, any theory of consciousness has to be able to explain the phenomenal binding problem. Like, why is it that we are not mind dust? Like, how is it possible that we can actually have, 100 billion neurons that are spatially distributed simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? And that, yeah, for a fact, in my opinion, almost no theory of consciousness can do, and doesn't even take seriously to begin with. And fourth, a theory of consciousness must be able to explain the causal role of consciousness, how it was recruited by natural selection, and why is it that we can talk about it. So all of these are kind of like really important constraints for a theory of consciousness. And yeah, I mean, in my opinion, a lot of like the prevailing theories of consciousness, in a sense, really fail at kind of like really understanding that these are like hard criteria you have to solve. A little bit of the case of, yeah, the theory dictating the fact more than the fact dictating the theory. Okay, so let's get on to probably like the most interesting and in a sense useful individual psychonaut. I mean, I don't believe he really had a think tank model. I mean, maybe a little bit. I think he was doing a cognitive science PhD when he was doing his explorations and talking to some of his friends, having experiences with some of his friends in a PhD capacity. I guess as an aside, I would definitely say that he has a line in one of his books where he says, drugs are wasted on the youth, because if you have like 18 years old taking LSD and going to a rave, that information is not going to aggregate very much. But if you have a 30-year-old PhD in cognitive science having LSD trips with other PhDs in cognitive science, and they're talking about those experiences in light of the frameworks that they know, there you actually have aggregation of information and actual kind of discussion of the properties of consciousness. And yeah, I mean, that's what really we should have more of, is actually kind of, yeah, young but not too young people studying these things in kind of a think tank capacity. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the phenomenological observations that Stephen Lehar made about exotic states of consciousness. And I really want to emphasize how unbelievably neglected Stephen Lehar is in academia. I mean, not only were his papers rejected, I think, for very bad reasons, but actually, like, nobody's paying attention to his psychonautic work. But I think it's actually world class. There's nothing better than this when it comes to developing facts that a theory of psychedelia has to explain. Okay, so I'll walk you through some of them. As a background, he has this amazing comic strip called Cartoon Epistemology. You can access online, where he discusses what is the actual structure of an experience. And in particular, this falls within the paradigm of indirect realism about perception. I mean, like, one of the main issues that we find with kind of like phenomenology, I don't know, if you go to the Amazonian tribes and you try to gather, ayahuasca phenomenology, it's not going to be very scientifically useful. Why? Because people are going to be interpreting those experiences in light of a direct realist account of perception. The naive and very common, commonsensical idea that you have direct perception of the world around you. And yeah, if you have psychedelic trips with that belief, yeah, I mean, you will be talking about like, well, a spirit that visited me and then this happened. And in a sense, you will take very literally, actually, the content of your experience as some kind of manifestation from another dimension. Again, maybe falling on the paranormal cluster. But Stephen Lehar is a hardcore, materialist, a hardcore indirect realist. He always says, yeah, no, anything and everything you experience is part of your internal world simulation. And we have to make sense of the very bizarre things that happen on psychedelics in terms of, alterations to the parameters of your world simulation. Yes. So anyway, full admiration. Hopefully more people will follow these. Should be pretty obvious, at least people who are like highly educated. But I mean, in practice, this is a kind of like a relatively rare framework, even among academia. It's my experience. Here's a little bit kind of like a further breakdown of an experience. According to Stephen Lehar, he actually breaks it down into 3 layers. You have the modal layer, which is color and taste and touch, essentially all the kind of like very specific qualia varieties that kind of like paint the walls of your experience in kind of like the paint of the theater of your experience. Then you have the middle circle, which is proprioception, is your feeling of where your body is located. And that's actually not a tactile feeling. And one of the crazy things is that on for example, DMT, you can experience tactile feelings way over here, but actually your body way over here. So there can be kind of a mismatch between proprioception and modal qualities, except that like usually they are kind of like this a control system that prevents them from veering too far off of each other. And then the last one is this motor planning space, which Stephen Lehar argues is actually implemented with a force field. I mean, this will probably take us very far afield, but I really recommend reading or seeing cartoon epistemology to kind of like get a sense of like what is it that Stephen is talking about here. All right, so now let's walk you through some of the fascinating observations that Stephen Lehar made. So, and this is like, I would title this as kind of like against learned helplessness. Why? Because for the most part, I think people have learned helplessness about being incapable of describing what happened on ketamine or what happened on LSD or DMT. It's just so far, quote unquote, beyond words, and you forget about it so quickly. You just say, it was ineffable, it was mystical, transcendental. I can't put it into words. But hey, we have a precedent. Stephen Lehar can put it into words. So come on, step up your game. That's my attitude in this case. So another very common thing for people to say is like, yeah, like psychedelics made me realize some things about myself. But then when I was asking about kind of like more like big questions and the nature of consciousness and so on, I realized that they didn't have answers. Well, Stephen Lehar has answers. He actually has answers, but he got the answers not because he was expecting them in a silver platter. He was not expecting, a machine elf actually handing him like the theory of consciousness. No, he got the answers because he was paying attention to the mathematical structure of the experience and really kind of like trying to put all of that in a framework. So yes, and what's really fascinating is that in this very short book, I think it's like 120 pages or something like that. Like, look at all of the exotic states of consciousness that he talks about, and I would say for every single one of these exotic states of consciousness, he mentions novel, true, and non-trivial things, like things that like are obvious in retrospect if you just had one of these experiences, but are like, yeah, novel, meaningful, and non-trivial. So huge kudos to Stephen Lehar. First, okay, dissociatives. Ketamine's fragmented consciousness. So he, in one of his pages, he talks about, a very important, I guess, like kudos as well to Stephen Lehar is that he actually independently, convergently to QRI. Like, I didn't know about this when we came up with neural annealing, but he actually analyzes ketamine from the point of view of annealing. He actually talks about a fragmentation phase and then an annealing phase, which is fascinating. That there's kind of this like convergent identification of physical phenomena that are alike what is going on phenomenologically. And when it comes to the kind of like annealing phase and fragmentation, basically he talks about like these. The quote is something like, some sketches, A is of being embedded in a vast matrix of similar fragments of consciousness. So basically you kind of like fragment into many, 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 many components, or you're one of those components and there's like a vast matrix of other ones. B is kind of like pushing against neighboring fragments, causes C, a reflection back from that direction, passing through. So you're one of these fragments, and as you're coming down, and all of this is annealing and recongealing, there's this very fascinating phenomenon where if you apply force in one direction, you will notice that there's a kind of like Newtonian physics, but it's jelly-like. There's a jelly-like Newtonian physics, and you can enter in resonance with the other fragments, and that's what actually allows you to reunify with them, which, this is a huge hint about the role of resonance in local binding, in actually unifying features of your experience into complete wholes. And C, a reflection back from that direction passing through, and D, reflecting back from the other direction until E, a resonance is established with the whole matrix wobbling like a jelly. So if you recently had ketamine on kind of a sensory deprivation environment, hopefully you can see what I'm talking about here. This is a non-trivial observation, but it's true. I mean, these are like wonky drawings, but this is a true thing. You take ketamine with an eye for this, and you will notice it. It's obvious after the fact. We have independently and convergently figured this out at QRI. Here's another fascinating thing, which is how are scenes constructed on dissociatives. So first of all, there's kind of this like propositional quality to scene construction. So a mental image of a concept on as a this on top of that. So if you kind of like have the qualia of the proposition of on, you will experience, yes, some kind of like separation, usually in a harmonic structure, in the sense of like dividing your experience into integers, because that makes it very energetically efficient. And you will continue to have kind of this like nebulous uncertainty on top and below. But then there is a progressive evolution of mental imagery as a simple sentence is parsed into mental image. So the box, you have the construction of the object is on, you have these kind of like propositional qualia developed, and then you have still uncertainty underneath the table, and then the table crystallizes, and then you have the box is on the table as the full construction of the scene. And dissociatives can like slow down this process enough for you to actually pay very close attention. Of course, there's the whole philosophical question of like, what does it mean for experience, the process to be slowed down? And if it's slowed down, is it really the same process? And, that's a whole conversation. But I think like once you notice this as a fact of scene construction and sentence parsing within experience, you will start noticing it all the time, that as you construct imaginary scenes or hallucinatory scenes, like on a DMT or ketamine, you will have kind of these like sentence parsing structure where, yes, you come up with an object, proposition, puts it in a spatial relationship, it opens up an area of ambiguity or uncertainty, and then there is kind of reification, lower of uncertainty, and then the actual sentence and scene crystallizes. So all of these could definitely be studied scientifically. I'm not convinced that really there's kind of like any theory that would be predicting this is the case in particular. It's more kind of like a raw phenomenological observation that is important to take into account. He also, he has kind of this sketches of the next day of the the dissociating progression of experiencing after consumption of PCP and marijuana. He talks of kind of like this feature fragmentation and how if local binding starts out with basically networks of resonance, which is a very big component of the theory of Stephen Lehar, you have a breakdown of those networks of resonance where more and more components essentially become disentangled from each other until you have the features essentially hanging out on their own. Like you don't actually see a couch, you see maybe the fragment of a cushion and the fragment of, the stove and the fragment of this and that, but they're not actually aggregating and putting themselves in resonance. Again, because you're all of these like fragmented, components of experience. Of course, as you re-anneal and you kind of like cool down, they can enter into resonance again, and then you will have the scene construction happen. Well, here's like his thoughts on salvia, right? He talks about impressions from a salvia trip as if consciousness is squeezed as in a vice. That's kind of like one important phenomenology. I mean, like, this is like widely reported. What I find really fascinating in this case from Stephen Lehar is, the fact that he seems to be getting right every single one of these exotic states of consciousness. Like consistent with the drug literature, consistent with trip reports and crazy images that were drawn like a lot later after his book. Okay, so as if consciousness is being squeezed as in a vice, but not uniformly, feeling as if embedded in a surface, right? So people talk about kind of becoming embedded in a flat sheet or something like that, a kind of like dimensionality collapse that happens on salvia. And then C and D, feeling as if embedded in a rolling cartwheel. An E, very fleeting impression of consciousness folding up like an umbrella. So I don't know about you guys, but like this is not exactly something that would anticipate predictive coding to generate a full theory of. Feel free to prove me wrong. But I would take this as like very raw phenomenological observations for the construction of a post-Galilean theory of consciousness. Okay, so here is perhaps some of the most relevant, fascinating observations. So, and this is something that happens on dissociatives and psychedelics alike. The perceptual experience of the sweeping out of a surrounding room, painting first the coarse outline. So essentially, you get kind of this hierarchical construction of the scene, as I was describing. But if you construct something that is L-shaped, right? Here's the thing. In any of these kind of like constructions of scenes on psychedelics and dissociatives, if you pay attention to it, you will experience both the geometry of it and a vibratory signature that comes with that. Again, I mean, maybe I sound ridiculous saying that, right? Because no particular theory of consciousness is right now predicting that. And it pattern matches with Wu or the paranormal. But no, you guys, like the vibratory signature of phenomenal objects is a very evident, obvious thing once you actually learn to pay attention to it on exotic states of consciousness. And in particular, in the case of an L-shaped room, you will actually experience these very crazy bimodal sound. So like rather than being kind of like a harmonious consonant sound that would arise from a cube, like or something like that, if you actually have like an L-shaped asymmetrical configuration, the vibratory signature, it will be something like which I mean, from a kind of like more developed point of view, that is very related to kind of like harmonic modes in a state of stress, or they're essentially failing to fully couple together, or they are coupling together and then they have like very high beat patterns. Again, something that has to be explained somehow, but I'll just leave it for the time being as kind of a very important phenomenological observation. Well, here's where it gets like even more trippy, but more profound. I think this is actually super important, where basically Lehar started to essentially figure out this thing he calls phase conjugate mirror theory of perceptual computation. Personally, I think this is the most advanced theory of perception out there, and I think it's probably true. And it essentially involves these crazy algorithms basically shock propagation and kind of like aggregation of waves of energy collide each other to detect symmetry points. And anyway, you should read the book. It's a subtle thing, but this is super profound and super important. And you're not going to understand consciousness unless you pay attention to these, in humble opinion. Okay, so to my knowledge, other than people at QRI, nobody understands the theories of Stephen Lehar and what he's talking about. But this is a gold mine of high quality phenomenological data, interpretation, and conceptual frameworks. I'm very confident, eventually, hopefully not posthumously, but yeah, he's going to be recognized as like somebody who actually provided the data for a good high quality theory of consciousness based on these exotic states of consciousness. But there's more. Okay, like Stephen Lehar, I would say, is probably the top, the best, rational psychonaut out there, hands down, when it comes to kind of like developing theories. Well, except I don't know, people at QRI. Then again, we're building on the shoulders of giants, I would say. So, not full credit here, but no, but there's like other people. I would strongly like, if you are interested in studying consciousness and psychedelics and meditations rigorously in an academic setting, of course you should absolutely read the latest predictive coding paper. You really should, and you should really read whatever is going on in psychophysics and whatever is going on in the free energy principle and so on. But also you should actually be watching these videos. So I think like my favorite ones, which I describe as kind of like outstanding psychonaut phenomenologists who are on YouTube, would be Junk Bond Trader. It's kind of hilarious because he's both a musician and a rational psychonaut. So you can see like his most watched videos are these like random music covers. And then also like DMT live trip #2, like a 20-minute video where he like does DMT live. And then really excellent content. Like if there's one video you should watch, it would be like this series, which is My DMT Year. He has like, it's a 4-part series. I think he starts out with a couple creepy trips. Like seriously, guys, there's no better content when it comes to like explaining what DMT is like than this sort of video, or maybe even that video in particular in the world. It's just world class. It's outstanding. And he's just a random YouTuber. Like, what is going on that like we're actually having the best information about these exotic states of consciousness off of YouTube and not off of nature? What is going on, you guys? Okay, so the other one to really look into, it's Yosikins. She was involved in Psychonaut Wiki and also this really amazing early stage, I believe like what became Psychonaut Wiki, which was Disregard Everything I Say, which was basically cataloging the effects of a whole bunch of different substances. But she recently started making videos, and the videos that she's made so far are excellent. I mean, she's like putting essentially a lot of these kind of phenomenological observations into a super condensed fashion and animating them with visuals. So top-notch content. I mean, hopefully you'll recognize how world-class this is. Then forerunners, people who I think have really strong potential and they may become world-class in the years to come. It's you have Kaleidoscope Eyes, like a girl who I believe she's a math major or studied math in university. And evidently she's reading QRI material, but also, she's kind of like coming up with her own theories based on like the actual phenomenology of these experiences. Another one is Psychs, etc. I would say like the problem with that channel is like it's not super philosophically cogent, but the phenomenology is pretty good, and you should check it out. And then like Trip Tips is more kind of like a how-to channel, but then like the phenomenology is still like super excellent. And then there's like other ones I would recommend you look at. I mean, you watch a bunch of these videos, go for a walk, and just watch a bunch of these videos over a month, and you will learn a lot. Even if you've had experiences before, you will remember things. Things will click into place as you listen to these videos. Adeptus Psychonautica, I believe he actually has interviewed me. Recommend that video, but also his other videos are really good. Your Mate Tom, especially when he describes the phenomenology of things such as LSD visuals. Sleepy Eye, he has like good phenomenological descriptions of DMT geometry. I mean, he watched the Harvard lecture on hyperbolic geometry of DMT experience, and then kind of trying to contribute. On top of that, the Quentin experiment, CG Kid, and Psyched Substance. Again, the previous ones are outstanding. These ones are good. Junk Bond Trader is the one I would say ignore at your own peril. Like in 10 years, 20 years, there's going to be a lot of science that like you will, in a sense, get a sneak peek by seeing these videos that like science really has not caught up to like actually what psychedelics are. I recommend watching, for example, Meeting God on DMT, like a live trip, or simulation theory, like he suddenly becoming convinced that we're in a simulation in the video itself, and then like coming out of that kind of delusion and explaining the phenomenology of that delusion. Fantastic content. I highly recommend all of that. What else? I also recommend Hyperspace Lexicon. In particular, these are, I think, like true phenomenological observations. Now, it is kind of like cast a little bit into spiritual or mystical language, but you have to admit some of that to get some of the juicy phenomenology. But I would definitely endorse these concepts. The centralite, Calone, kinesioptic, luminorgasm, and magnetoentanglement, and trip reports that feature these. This is useful. This is actually super useful. This is real things that happen on DMT. Personally, I think they're happening in your brain, but they're real, and I'm pretty sure current theories have not much to say about these. Okay, so like things that I think other phenomenological observations that merit more research according to QRI. This is just a list. Tracer tool, some research that we've done on basically the phenomenal character of tracers. We have kind of like this Photoshop of tracers, or Photoshop-like tool for tracer effects. And there's like a lot of insights from that. Field computing, like this is from insights from Stephen Lehar, merging them with Michael Johnson, and definitely a lot of things that I have written and figured out. I mean, basically, don't think of the brain as a digital computer, or it's not analogous to a Turing machine or a connectioning system. Actually, the brain seems to be computing with fields. Again, this is not something that a theory right now is going to say, but I think it's true. And if you actually embrace and explore this paradigm, you will be way ahead of science. Okay, CDNS of the body, I think I'll explain that in a second. An explicit binding via resonance in a hierarchy of coupled oscillators, which explains fractals and global coherence. Okay, so psychedelic tracers, of course, we would be very happy to collaborate with if you want to do a study, if you're doing your PhD on psychedelics and you want to actually get at, let's get some good facts to furbish a future theory, I think like psychedelic tracer replication is really, really, really good. So essentially here are like some facts that we have found. There's different frequencies for different drugs. So like all of these kind of like woo or hippie, like, oh, LSD has a certain frequency. And roughly we have it where 2CB, I mean, this is very primitive, like 2CB might have like a frequency of tracers of around like 12 hertz. LSD, maybe it's kind of like 15 and 20 hertz. Psilocybin a little bit higher. And then you have like DMT, which is 30 hertz, and 5-MeO DMT, which is about like 40 hertz. Why is the case? We don't know. But let's first catalog these facts, right? Before we kind of like decide on a theory. And also, very importantly, the DMT flickers the afterimage between blue and yellow. So basically between a color and its inverse after image. Whereas 5-MeO-DMT generates monochrome after images. And we think this is actually super significant, that actually the flickering between a color and its opposite, it's generating information. And it's information that the experience can build on top of. And in that way, yes, on DMT, that explains kind of the very chaotic information generation that emerges. Whereas on 5-MeO-DMT, there's kind of this convergence to a more simplified experience. And yeah, I mean, if you think of it as like, okay, you overlay the same qualia on top of itself, kind of everything unifies and everything becomes monochrome, as opposed to DMT is like, yeah, you're flickering back and forth, and it builds on top of each other and complex structures and so on. So yeah, this is like very low level fact that may explain a lot of the emergent phenomenology in higher doses. A very other important phenomenological observation, this is both true in physics and in consciousness, is that there is a duality between the vibration and the shape of your experience. So essentially, in the Chladni plate, this is a mechanical wave propagating in a basically a metallic sheet. If you make it vibrate at a certain frequency, you will see that only the frequencies that are nearby to the one that you're vibrating that fit an integer number of times, basically what's called the resonant modes of the plate, are essentially viable attractors. Why? Because every other frequency cancels each other out if they don't fit an integer number of times. But the really crazy thing is that this entails that there is kind of this duality between shape and frequency on the one side, the shape of the object and frequency, and the resonant shape that emerges. What are the nodal patterns? And that seems to be true on consciousness as well. I mean, like the resonant modes that Stephen Lehar was talking about. Yes, when you construct a room on DMT or ketamine or LSD, you can notice that its shape and its vibroacoustic properties are duals of each other. The vibe of a scene and its shape are duals of each other. This is why I think in a lot of spiritual circles, for example, people say like, oh, don't pay attention to the DMT hallucinations, they're distractions. What really matters is the internal energy flow, your inner processing or something like that. Well, guess what? I think they're duals of each other. Like what is going on in the crazy patterns and tactile hallucinations is a reflection or is the other side of the coin of what is going on emotionally. And I mean, as a fact that we have picked up so far is that if you have very blissful, harmonious, pro-social states of consciousness, that comes together with harmonious and symmetrical and consonant shapes in the experience. Again, feel free to prove me wrong, but I believe this is one of these facts that, yeah, I mean, we know far ahead of, yeah, basically the scientific literature, partly because we pay attention to valence, we pay attention to actually what makes an experience feel good or bad, and kind of like try to identify correlations between that and, you know, the features of the experience. And yeah, this is kind of from a talk about quantifying bliss, a paradigm of QRI that we are currently developing and testing with neuroimaging. It's a whole field that we are starting, but essentially, we believe that the shapes that you experience on psychedelics will actually ultimately, be super predictive to actually the mood that you're having. This is just kind of like a placeholder slide, but like essentially, you can apply this we call the CDNS decomposition, consonance, dissonance, noise signature of your energy body, which is a phenomenological property of your experience. If you doubt, the existence of the energy body, I would ask you to, ask yourself if you believe that attention is real. I mean, attention is not an object, but attention is clearly real when it comes to like the structure of your experience. And I would say, the same with the energy body is a feature, a phenomenal feature of your experience. And the reason why something like ketamine can be so beneficial for treatment-resistant depression is not exactly because it's allowing you to process, like prediction errors or something like that. It's much more because it's allowing you to disregard prediction errors such that you get in touch with these very beautiful harmonic resonant waves that goes across the entirety of your body. Okay, so that's what's happening at the phenomenological level. And that's very warm and high valence and blissful and pleasant. And we suspect that actually that is the mechanism of action. Like if you actually got that from your ketamine trip, as you cool down, as you come down, you will re-anneal, but with a kind of smooth energy body. And because of the duality between the regularity of the energy body and valence, essentially that will give you a much better felt sense after the trip. This is of course fully testable, and we could talk about questionnaires to test it. But this is very divorced from kind of current paradigms, isn't it? But it is really taking seriously the phenomenology, and I think this is probably the way to go. Here are just some quotes from Seeing That Freeze by Rob Burbea, a really famous meditation teacher. His most famous book, Seeing That Freeze, where he talks about the energy body. So, for example, he says, the harmonization and unification in well-being that is characteristic of samadhi, this very blissful, high equanimity, high concentration, tranquility state, can also be regarded as a harmonization, alignment, smoothing out, and opening of the flows of energies of the subtle body. So he is noticing this dual correspondence. In a sense, we had noticed it already at QRI. And then reading the book is like, yes, okay, this guy gets it, except he was understanding it only from the point of view of meditation, but it's the same thing. Meditation as a energized state of consciousness resembles has a lot of psychedelic features. And there's a couple other quotes you can also check out in the recording. Finally, I think I'm getting towards the end of the presentation. Yeah, we have kind of this hypothesized duality between the phenomenal texture of the experience and not only the vibratory signature, but also the computational state. Like actually, what is it that you're processing? And the claim actually here is that resisting vibrations in your energy body when you're on a psychedelic has a dual correspondence with resisting information, the spread of information. So when there's a realization that is too painful, you don't want to accept it or embrace it, that will manifest as you're resisting a vibration. So that's something to think about. I think it's phenomenologically true. And I think, we have to figure out how to actually make it fit with any kind of neuroscientific paradigm. We would definitely propose a kind of marriage between rebus and neural annealing. Although, that's a much longer conversation and much more technical. Finally, this insight suggests achieving states where energy feels liberated, where you don't have these blockages, might be especially useful for therapy. So if we can increase the probability of that happening, you will have probably much better therapeutic outcomes. Second, we have this issue that basically cross-modal coherence might have therapeutic value of its own. So if you're on ketamine, you experienced a coupling between your visual field and some beautiful resonant waves and your energy body, and they were in sync. Yeah, that probably is beneficial because it's essentially generating this coherence and this symmetry that will anneal a positive valence into your experience. And due to Hebbian learning, you're in a sense reconfiguring the connections of your brain. So this is not just epiphenomenal. It's not just during the trip. Second, cross-scale coherence may also have therapeutic value. This has to do with the whole set of fractals, families of fractals that you can experience on exotic states. The feeling of being in a washing machine can be reinterpreted through a lens of neural annealing on ketamine. And finally, triangulating a good vibe might have counterintuitively good effects. So if you feel bad, can you identify a region of your energy body that is discordant, or a region of kind of the vibratory signature of the hallucinations that is discordant? Okay, maybe fix that. And if you fix that, your feeling will feel better, and vice versa. So you can kind of triangulate and improve the valence that way as a form of navigation for exotic states of consciousness. This is just kind of placeholder again, alternative paradigms of computing. All of this actually suggests that, the brain is much more than a computer, or classical computer. It also uses wave-like computation, also uses holistic field behavior, and uses topological computing, which I don't have time to argue for, but I would assign a very high confidence that, the brain is actually also a topological computing engine, completely not covered by current paradigms as far as I know. just some examples to kind of like illustrate some of the points I was making, which is like, yeah, on DMT, you experience this, yeah, profound kind of like patchwork of resonant modes. And when they're discordant with each other, they don't fit together very well. Yeah, that's an unpleasant experience. If you can lay them out in a way that their interactions are in phase, that will correspond to a very positive experience. 5-MeO DMT, on the other hand, tends to generate kind of like this feeling of pure space or pure consciousness, a much deeper level of symmetry, which, yeah, basically gives rise to both much more consonant and also much more dissonant experiences. So, yeah, important to consider. And I think this is one of the final slide, which is basically, if you lay out the state space of consciousness as this interplay between information content and energy levels, some of the facts that we have to integrate into science is that, yeah, I mean, essentially DMT pushes you towards kind of this middle level of complexity, but energy across the board. So kind of like the DMT, machine elves, and plasma consciousness, and all of that crazy irreducible complexity would be kind of like way at the top, in the middle. Whereas, yeah, 5-MeO DMT tends to concentrate to the left. It's kind of like only very clean, pure, or highly dissonant, but low information, highly symmetrical configurations of consciousness arise, which, because of the dual correspondence, as I was explaining, in a sense, like come with very, very high valence or very, very low valence. And that's about it. So thank you, everybody. Very, very happy to open it up for discussions and answer questions. And there you go. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Nemo.
Thank you for that. That was really good. Very interesting. We have, the floor is now open for questions. We don't have any questions currently. Apart from, I have a few questions. So where to start? So I was wondering with these like, maybe for a prospective psychonaut, these sort of like observations, sometimes when you're trying to do something on these substances, like, it can really make your experience like spiral if you have like an expectation. Sort of like, when is the observation done? Is it like sort of retrospectively, or are you explicitly trying to go somewhere during these experiences?
No, I mean, I think the the optimal time to do an observation is actually during the experience. And there's definitely kind of like this subtlety where it is the case that for most people, most experiences will be very semantically loaded. So they will be kind of like processing internal, content, family trauma, or like, hang-ups, breakups, and so on. But even then, I would recommend, okay, like, look at in what way the feelings that you're processing correspond to the structure of the patterns that are arising and the quality of the vibe that is there. And I mean, honestly, I think like it's something that, like, even if you're caught up in the semantic content, if you have kind of like some reminder of like, okay, every 10 minutes, I'm going to take note of like the phenomenal character, you can have like a fairly regular, normal trip and still get a lot of really high quality phenomenological data. That said, the absolute best data will come from people who don't have, very much hang-ups. Usually it's going to be people who are very emotionally stable, who have a lot of experience already. Maybe they've had like 100 LSD trips. And then it's like, okay, on this trip, I'm going to explore the duality between shape and vibratory modes. And then it's like, okay, 10 hours just looking at that. And that, I think it's, where most of the breakthroughs will actually happen.
Yeah, so they've got all their like therapy stuff out of the way, and now they can look at the actual what's going on. Okay.
But I would suggest, I definitely do suggest that learning about these correlations and like these like facts that I was sharing actually makes emotional processing easier. So like it is actually synergistic. And in a different talk called Mapping the Heaven Realms, I think I go a little bit deeper into this, where I articulate how, like, for example, developing equanimity and loving kindness is really helpful for navigating these spaces, and also will manifest in like different vibratory phenomena. And like, so it is kind of, you get the best of both worlds. You get like, oh, I'm actually having a much better experience, processing emotions better, and the insight that this is correlated is really, really forefront and obvious. So.
Yeah, I guess being able to make sense of the phenomenological aspects sort of like allow you to process any semantic content a bit easier as well.
Yep.
Okay, there aren't any more questions in the chat. Could you, so you mentioned briefly about this field computing of the brain. do you mind like briefly touching like a little bit more on what that is?
Yeah, so
I say briefly, it's probably not very brief, but yeah.
Oh my goodness. Field computing, topological computing in consciousness. Well, so what can I say? So maybe I'll give you like one hint, which is like something to pay attention to as another possible fact. It is being reported in the literature in various ways, but it's really stunning, which is, okay, how is color actually painted on your visual field? Color is field in. So like one example of like a trip report, somebody on psilocybin, super smart introspective guy on psilocybin, had this experience where, okay, like there was I believe like a blue ball or something like that. And a blue ball, they were looking at like, I don't know, like 3 grams of psilocybin, some serious dosage, and like looking at the blue ball, and then like kind of imagining that the edges of the blue ball are open, or like there's kind of like a little opening in there, and then like doing a little kind of like perceptual trick, and then all of a sudden the blue starts like aquarella kind of like spreads outside of the ball and like fills the entire field of the visual field, and then the entire visual field becomes this super intense, pretty homogeneous blue. I mean, there's still kind of shapes and things going on, but like the primary experience is blue. So here's one fact: colors can escape the objects to which they belong. I mean, if you look at kind of like classic kind of like visual illusions, I wish I should have put some on the presentation, but Stephen Lehar has like a lot of these in his website. You have kind of like this like very fun like visual illusions where you have like a line that has like color only in one side, and like it's kind of like you have a wiggly line like this. And you will notice that you hallucinate the presence of color in the empty space if it is kind of like connected to edges that have that color. So, and also the same with, I'm sure you've seen those images where like 2 squares are actually the same gray, right? Yeah. The same gray, but the edge is kind of like slightly disjointed, and you have like, okay, this is slightly more black, this is slightly more white. Yeah. And it looks like all of this is white and all of this is black, or like different shades of gray. Okay, that's a visual illusion, but it shows that color is actually painted by feeling in, by propagating. So color actually propagates as a wave of energy, and it is essentially a balance of forces. I mean, like the reason this black is not extending further is because there is a corresponding beige that is also trying to push against it. But if you disturb the balance of those forces, yeah, the black can actually escape and can do weird things. So that to me is like a dead ringer. Like, yeah, this is field computing. This is not, as is traditionally thought of, like, oh, it's just a hierarchy of edge detectors and, you know, color pixels or something like that in the visual cortex. Like, it's not like that.
No, it doesn't feel like that either.
No.
You don't really feel like a matrix processing machine learning algorithm.
No. And the other thing for sure is the vibratory phenomena. That like, essentially all of your experience behaves as a whole. I mean, the metaphor I'll use is molecules, right? It's like a molecule is made of like, let's say like 20 carbon atoms or something like that. And like in some sense, like the pairwise interactions between the atoms are like contributing to vibration of the molecule. But then there's also the vibration of the entire molecule. And I mean, there's like names in chemistry for those. I think like, you know, rocking and wagging and scissoring and
speaking my language here. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, yeah. So that's like that the whole molecule vibrates. Oh, yeah, and you can recognize its spectrum. It's like, oh yeah, this is the spectrum of linalool because like it's the whole molecule is vibrating this way. Not only the functional groups, like the whole molecule. So that would be a holistic field behavior. It's like you need to take into account the entire object to make sense of the resonant mode. Hey, the same is going on in experience. You need to take into account the entire configuration to get at kind of the Fourier decomposition, to get at these like vibratory frequencies.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, this is definitely good food for thought. I think everyone is just processing because there's no questions in the chat. Everyone must be just like, oh my god. Yeah. What do I have here? Oh yeah. I think we already kind of mentioned this, but I was like wondering, you know, having a better epistemology would allow for sort of way better control of the experience. You know, it can feel like sometimes you're just strapped into a roller coaster and there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, what do you think?
Absolutely. So I will say that like very experienced psychonauts can experience very chaotic, unpleasant trips still if they take a high dose of a chaotic substance. Like, I mean, I might highlight, for example, like psilocybin, DMT, like because it's pushing to like that high energy, like middle information content region. It can be overwhelming, no matter how experienced you are. I mean, maybe if you have a super advanced equanimity. I mean, I do believe somebody like Daniel Ingram or Shenzhen Yang, you probably can feed them like 10 grams of mushrooms and they'll be fine. But those are extreme cases, right? So rather, I think there's like two benefits from kind of like these like more developed epistemology and kind of like describing things in terms of phenomenal character. A is you do have a little bit of kind of a leverage when it comes to, okay, like I'm experiencing a bad sensation. How can I locate this sensation? Is it in my body? Can I do a relaxation process? Can I do some like insight meditation or concentration meditation to undo the knot? Oftentimes that may do it. Like that might be just enough. Another thing is like you can introduce exogenous input in a much more targeted way. So like if you identify like, hey, actually I'm experiencing dissonance that does feel like it's a beat pattern around like 15 hertz. Hey, you can actually put like music that has kind of like a rhythmic, 15 hertz vibration, and it's going to transform that beat pattern from something unpleasant into something that is actually enjoyable. So that is kind of like, paying attention there like really helps. But by and large, I would say the best way in which this actually contributes to much better experiences, more useful experiences, is in actually better drug choice and dosage and combination choice to begin with. So like as an example, I didn't talk about this due to lack of time, but like there's this whole other kind of paradigm called free-willing hallucinations, which is states of consciousness where you actually have control over what is it that you want to experience. Like you can say like, I want to see a table, and then like a table starts to materialize, similar to the sentence parsing architecture from Stephen Lehar is like a table, and I want a lamp on top of it, and I want. So there are states of consciousness where you can do that, and it's not chaotic, and you can actually construct whatever scene you want. And they are, generally speaking, what results from combining small to medium doses of both psychedelics and dissociatives. So just as an example from a good number of trip reports, approximately like 50 to 100 micrograms of LSD combined with 50 to 100 milligrams of ketamine and 5 milligrams of THC edible. I know it's like a crazy recipe, but if you combine that, sorry?
Nice little cocktail.
Yeah, it's a cocktail. I mean, I'm sure it's done a lot. Like a lot of people have done it. It's just not systematically, or I don't know. probably at raves or something, not in a controlled environment. But if you do it in a controlled environment with the purpose of investigating consciousness, you will notice that you gain this very strange control over your experience, and that it will be a free-willing hallucination. You can construct a museum of consciousness where you kind of like play with the various properties and features. It's like, okay, how high can I put the curvature over here? Like if I make a jar, how textured can that jar be? You can explore with the parameters and see the limit of it. Like Stephen Lehart talks about, he loves to fly airplanes. So like in a free-willing hallucination, he was like constructing an airplane and simulating like he was like flying in France. And he noticed like, yeah, well, it looks very realistic. It looks real, but it has limitations. Like for example, the control board doesn't have as many buttons. So you can actually quantify the complexity of the experience by counting how many buttons you can actually make in your free-willing hallucination. And that's going to be very useful information, I think, for science. And then there's, of course, like the further question of like, why would combining these substances give rise to a more controllable experience? And there, I think, actually, it comes down again to kind of this crazy duality between vibratory, signature, and shape, that essentially drugs can be understood as like from the lens of signal processing. So one of the models that we play with, especially after the tracer tool and more phenomenological club discussions, is that psychedelics, to a first approximation, are delay effects. So essentially, you're overlaying kind of a qualia that you experienced like 50 milliseconds ago on top of your current experience, and you get kind of like this like looping and overlay effect. Dissociatives, on the other hand, are reverb effects. You're kind of like overlaying a much more continuous and smooth version of previous experiences, which actually is kind of shared with weed to some extent, except dissociatives do it like in a much more extreme way. And if you look in audio, like what happens when you combine delay effects with reverb effects, you get this compounding synergy that generates like standing wave patterns. And the standing wave patterns can actually be fairly stable. So my interpretation here is that by combining these kind of like signal processing effects on top of each other, you're stabilizing these vibratory modes, and that allows you to play with them.
Yeah, no, that is a good theory. All right, I think if no one else has any questions, we'll probably just end that there. Seems like a good place to end.
Sounds good to me.
I encourage everyone to check out Andrés' blog and Qualia Research Institute website, because they're both very good reading. All right. Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Infinite bliss, and talk to you soon.